Welcome to Aethair Talks, talking tech, policy, and the air we breathe. I'm Vasilios Nasis. In each episode, we dive into innovations, insights, and ideas shaping the future of environmental intelligence. From air quality to data and regulation to real-world impact, this is where meaningful conversations begin. In today's episodes, we're joined by Steve Barrett, partner at Hamburg and Rubin Law Firm, for a conversation in policy, liability, and the future of environmental data. Hi, Steve. Thank you for joining us today in our podcast.
Hello, Vasilios, and thank you for having me.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your firm?
Steve Barrett, attorney for over 30 years with a mid-sized firm in Philly, but also a lot of the work is in the surrounding counties and throughout the state of Pennsylvania. We have a multi-practice. We have a significant presence in the environmental sectors of law throughout the state. We represent a lot of also government entities, ranging from municipalities to sewer authorities to water authorities. And we do a fair bit of litigation as well around issues and standards that deal with those topics.
I see. Great. So having said that, I mean, one of the the reasons clients of ours are using our platform is primarily for meeting compliance needs. Okay, whether this is OSHA, whether it's EPA, or any other type of compliance needs. So, having said that, one of the big things that we have seen, especially in the non-regulated type of sectors, such as indoor air quality monitoring, specifically in commercial buildings and so on. People many times in those sectors, they say, well, look, I like the indoor air quality monitoring idea, but why should I do it? Do I expose myself into things that, I don't necessarily want my tenants to know about it or my employees to know about it? So from your point of view, from a legal point of view,
Yep.
The fact that there is no regulation, does this make you less vulnerable to liabilities that you may expose yourself to?
Right. So to unpack that, the phrase you made, which was interesting, is because there's no regulation. What went in my head when you said that is to insert the word yet. And I thought of that word as you were asking the question, because there's no regulation yet. As we all know, I mean, it's historic. I don't need to give history lessons, but particularly in modern day sectors of workplace and even residential living spaces. But what's happening is a blend, as you know, and I don't need if you can well explain it as I. But the WELS standard, that deals with sort of the wellness of occupants of buildings, as opposed to LEED, LED, which is sort of like the environmental impact. And there's a merging that's going on with private and what's out there by way of monitoring and technology. So when the media starts to tell the world, tell the people about hazards and issues and how they become really big stories that deal with healthful impact, well, the marketplace has to keep current, because you want to be able to sell, to project, to publicize, to bring in dollars through customers or occupants or even commercial spaces that, oh, we now are consistent with, we have considered, we have addressed. The very simple, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, is the organic, right? Well, people believe through studies, whether it's accurate or not, but the consciousness of people is, I want to eat clean food. It's healthier for me.
Yeah.
So then there's a whole industry that's created what's called organic, and they're certifying, even though it's not regulated, certifying that's gone through this private analysis testing entity that says we can put our stamp on it. It doesn't have any of these ingredients. It doesn't have any of these GMOs. It doesn't have any of these components, and that therefore creates an industry of revenue. So the question is, talking about compliance and regulation, we are seeing a lot of driven consumerism, if you want to use that with a capital C, whether it's commercial space, whether it's in factories, whether it's in even cutting edge automated factories of some degree. If there's going to be something that is going to cause a quote unquote emission slash byproduct slash whatever you want to call it, because people are more conscious of quote unquote what's good or bad for them, the market will want to essentially fill that vacuum and say, hey, we can deal with that, but it's not regulated yet. Now, you probably have the next question, which I'll let you ask, well, what does that mean by way of consequences legally, financially, and exposures? So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, actually, you know, you touch a very good point. The food, for instance, right? I think it was probably in the 90s when the whole revolution about health and wellness, about what we eat, is important and how it affects us short term and long term. And the whole idea of wellness, right? That's when probably the whole idea started in the 90s. Now, as opposed to food, that you see what you eat, all right? Air, you don't see it. Actually, one of our sort of slogans is that we enable people to see the air they breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, we do that. But having said that, especially in the commercial spaces,
Right.
because nobody can dictate what you're going to do in your house, in your home, right? But especially in commercial spaces, whether it's an office, whether it's commercial building, school, hospital, whatever that might be. The fact that there is not a regulation in place, and or maybe people can have those certifications, such as the wealth certification that you mentioned earlier, that more or less what it says is that, look, we evaluated the space once a year and it's good.
Right. Right.
Okay. And you see a lot of spaces, in this day and age that may have a seal that they say, oh, certified for air quality. That doesn't necessarily mean it's continuous.
Right.
Which is a very big difference, continuous versus sort of a survey
Right.
type of monitoring. So having said that, if you're exposed into a space that has some vulnerable, some elements essentially that may affect, people's, um, health, short term or long term.
Right.
The fact that it's not regulated, you as an owner, business owner, does this expose you to,
The
to
short
dangers?
answer is absolutely yes. And to unpack the absolutely yes is that exposure, liability, and claims do not get generated because you fail to comply with a stated governmental standard. If there's a governmental standard, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, that possibly can be used as a basis for claiming somebody or a company did wrong. But it's not just because you deviate from that. What the law would say, where it's not regulated, is what did you know and should you have known about it? Because if you have a harm to somebody's physical well-being, if a company is doing business and because of qualities, particularly air, that they have to vacate or they have to change their business model or whatever the case may be, you're getting into all these iterations for a company realizing that there's a problem where they're in, let's say, a long-term lease and it's a multi-million-dollar company and their operations out of a certain place. The interesting aspect is that you can have now economic loss, lost profits. You're talking about millions of dollars in addition to whether somebody gets harmed physically, whether it's a pulmonary or lung issue, whether there's other bacterium because the air is not maintained properly. And even in that instance, you could get economic loss because if a company, let's say, has 50 workers or 100 workers somewhere, and they don't have sort of all of a sudden these ready-made alternate spaces, and they have to displace all these people, that leads not only to their harm, but also leads to economic harm for the company. So it's what you know and what you should have known. And therefore, it's not necessarily generated or driven by, quote unquote, a regulation that has an inherent basis of a standard, right? That's quote unquote deemed safe by the government, below or above which that really, in many instances, could be even irrelevant. The question is, wait a minute, if you are aware and you're not doing something about it, and we do suffer the harm and loss, this is not a sort of a bashing lawyers, but as we know, to be real about it, if there is such a situation with such loss that I just described, you're going to find a lawyer to want to bring an action.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? You're going to find a team. You're going to find people that specialize in this area. You're going to go on the internet. You're going to go on, Reddit. You're going to go on whatever to say, oh, and they're going to say, I see an opportunity here.
Actually, you brought up a very good point. One of the things that we have seen, especially after COVID, because COVID is really what brought into the whole domain the idea of air quality monitoring. I mean, in the end of the day, why did everything shut down?
Right.
It shut down because there was something in the air and we couldn't monitor the air quality or monitor the virus propagation, which, by the way, scientifically speaking, we know how the virus propagates, through particles and so on, right?
Right.
So the technology was there. The fact, though, lack of implementation, it's really what led to shutting down the entire world. And I don't think that in the modern, history of the world, that there was any other event that had such a tremendous impact across the board.
And what you found is a lot of companies that suffered business loss, they put claims around the world, let alone the U.S. industries and business sector, for economic loss, claiming that we suffered, it's covered under the policy, so therefore you have to pay us what our economic loss was because we had to shut down. And insurance industry has spent millions of dollars fighting that. It's all depending on what's the language of the coverage, of the policy. So again, it creates legal issues, right? You're bringing a claim. If they deny it, there's going to be a lawsuit brought. And there's been tons of lawsuits saying, I want the court to declare, I want the court to rule that based on the policy and based on the circumstances, you, Ms. or Mr. Insurance Company, have to pay out on this. So that generated a whole industry of lawsuits.
To the best of your knowledge, have you seen any changes on policies, insurance policies around that?
Yes. So like everything else, there's an evolution in life, there's an evolution in the law, there's evolutions with insurers. Because now underwriting takes place. So, well, first with the COVID, yes, but even more broadly with just air quality, whether it's the fires in LA, whether it's elevated rates because the Canadian fires, was it last year, and the smoke came down, whether recently the New Jersey fires and the fires in Illinois, it's happening so persistently and so not predictably as to when it's going to occur, but predictable that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when there's going to be, major contaminants that affect large urban areas and commercial areas, right? Urban meaning residential and commercial sectors. Underwriters now are going to require that you put in air monitoring at a much more sophisticated level. Because what does it do? If you don't do it, right, then they could say, sorry, you don't have the coverage. But if you do it, then they're saying, well, then we're protected and you're protected. Because if you do it, you're going to have less claims. You're going to say, no, we had all the quality assurance and data to be able to say, your claim cannot withstand. Your claim is not viable because we did do what we're supposed to do and it has not been yet regulated. But the insurance industry can, quote unquote, privately regulate it through the underwriting process.
Actually, one of the things that we have noticed, especially with the larger corporations that they are clients of ours, they implement our platform for indoor and outdoor air quality monitoring, simply so they can indicate that, look, we have pollution inside the building. We do the best possible things to prevent it, but also that pollution is coming from outdoors, possibly. in cases of wildfires, let's say.
There's another defense.
Right? And then on top of that, another reason why they do that is because, the market has been flooded right now by, extremely low cost type of sensors that people can source them from all different places. And again, you can't blame people. They will probably go for the lowest possible gadget, available in the market.
They'll go to Lowe's and get the Shark air filter system. Yeah.
And essentially they will just get the device and, hoping that it's going to give them some sort of indication of what's happening in the space. Now, that's it. These same people, they take those devices in workplaces as well.
Right.
And, you know, again, without knowing accuracy, without having any calibration type of
Right.
documentation, they're like, look, the air quality is bad. So now they can create a whole case around that. So employers or building owners, by having these continuous data that comes from, places like our platform, that it's, high credibility data, continuous data, from coming from devices that have been fully calibrated,
Right.
essentially gives them a whole different level of defense. And we have seen so many such cases right now, from commercial buildings, schools, clinics, that they have fought any sort of attempts, you know, from the other side, to make claims against them.
Right. I always, it's the old adage in law and in life, like once you know of something that could be potentially dangerous and there's evidence that the company, the whatever, is aware, well, that creates, I'm not saying absolutely, but there's a doctrine under law that arguably that creates duty once you have knowledge. So it's not regulated, right? You don't have to quote unquote comply to some governmental standard, whether it's local, state, or federal. But if you have knowledge of something and some company or a person gets harmed, and all of a sudden you get the evidence, you have knowledge that, you learn that, well, they were aware of that. Again, not regulated. Well, guess what? Does legally a duty attach where you needed to mitigate that or do something about that? So with data, again, it's new or should have known or should know. If you should be getting data to know, you have the capacity, you have the ability, and you have knowledge to do it, or you do it and you have the information, but you don't do anything, then you're risking exposure. Then insurance is going to kick in. They could disavow for that. They could say, no, your claim doesn't apply. Or on the other end, I was talking about, they may require you to affirmatively get that data because it protects the insurance company. The insurance company doesn't want to spend money where it doesn't have to. So if they require you to spend more money under the policy to get a lower premium to put in, let's say, your platform, and they're getting all this data, okay, first of all, the company's protected unto itself, but also the insurance company's happy. And how many businesses could survive without having a real good, viable insurance company in place? That's almost like an essential.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask you, do you know of any glorified cases that, essentially went to the court about?
There's a glorified case, and there's a whole history of American global history about this. So the simple one, which, I don't know if you have to be a generational connect person, because it's not much in back in the 80s and 90s and the 70s, it was just, you heard the word, it was like everybody knew what happened. When where we're sitting here in Philadelphia, it grew, and it happened here. It was called Legionnaires. It was at a major hotel in Philadelphia, and people at this conference, the Legionnaires, not only got sick, some of them started dying, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And then with industrial hygienists and forensics, they realized that it was in the air system, that there was this virus that was being generated because of a faulty air system. Not monitoring, but essentially for lack of a better term, the HVAC, call it, right?
Yeah.
And it was not functioning properly. It generated this virus that people started to get sick and die from. And again, there wasn't necessarily compliance about it, but what was the theory as to that led to millions and perhaps billions ultimately, both in the damages, the hotel itself losing business. The question was, well, you should have known that your system wasn't operating properly, which ultimately led to this horrible outcome, creating this virus that everybody was breathing in the hotel. And it got the catchphrase Legionnaire's disease because it was a Legionnaire conference, and most of the hotel was occupied by people participating at the conference and attending it that were Legionnaires, and that's why so many got sick and died. So there was one. And then the other one, which is, litigation that's still going on to this day, is asbestos. Before World War II, there were these empires that were financial empires, these asbestos manufacturing and mining companies, South Africa, Canada, and the mines, the asbestos mines. And then they would ship it down here into U.S., where there'd be specific asbestos manufacturing plants, unregulated, not compliant, and people, because it's a latent disease, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, means it could take years before the effects of asbestos could show. Well, as we know, asbestos is just almost, not everybody, but it's a core piece of personal injury litigation that's been going on for generations now. And the argument was that a lot of these asbestos mining companies and even manufacturing companies, they had their own divisions. And through legal discovery, and learning the documentation and deposing certain witnesses, they knew of the dangers of asbestos. They had industrial hygienists that were doing the testing on it, and that just opened up the floodgates that you knew. It wasn't regulated, but again, what you should have known. You knew it was dangerous, and you were putting it out there in the marketplace, and people were getting not just sick, but horrible diseases, lung cancer, mesothelioma, a disease called asbestosis, major impairments, or just death. So there you have a situation that litigation is still going on to this day that is costing billions of dollars.
And again, I'm not talking about also the personal toll. I mean, the financial toll, the impact that this created.
Well, the footnote to that is the pre-World War II companies that had billions of dollars in years. I mean, you're talking about huge companies out of South Africa, out of Canada. They went belly up because of litigation. And those companies employed hundreds and thousands of employees around the world, right? And they were providing product. I mean, asbestos was in cigarettes, not only just the boilers and the heat-resistant products for big industries, but they were in, believe it or not, baseball gloves, professional baseball gloves in the 30s. It was a universal product that could be weaved, it could be cemented, and then when that had to be pulled out, once it became regulated, now all these industries had to spend billions of dollars to find replacements. So it has a major impact across the board. Health, commercial success and impact, economic loss. It was a sea change with the asbestos.
So I want to touch into a couple things here. One is you said that the fact that you knew, but you didn't take any actions, made you liable, or you should have known that something works or it doesn't. Which brings me to the point that I want to discuss with you. Having data, as you mentioned earlier, well, actually, you said you need to have the data. But what I want to make sure here is that we understand is data needs to be credible. I think that's what I want to emphasize. Because, again, a lot of things can produce data, but how credible is that data? Okay? And it's actually I think last week in Chicago, there was a whole panic that was created one morning I think it was Wednesday, April 23rd, that everybody woke up and they saw notifications on their phone that the air quality was severely bad. And people were going social media, this and that,
Right.
which in reality wasn't. It was a glitch on some of the sensors that the phone carriers, get the data from and put it on
Yep.
on their phones, right? So doesn't that expose companies to potential legal issues? The fact that they create a whole public panic.
That's a whole hot mess. I mean, the first target with all that panic and disarray, even just the economic loss potentially, people staying home, people not being productive. I mean, I could see class actions. I could see companies not only putting in claims, perhaps, but then insurance companies can stand in the shoes of the people they reimburse to say, we are owed money. Okay, so you have insurance companies, you have the industries themselves. And guess what? The first thing I would think as a lawyer, if it, I can't practice in Illinois, but I'd be sitting there saying, what caused the glitch? Because it was something that should not have happened, and you didn't have some fail-safe mechanism or something that should have corrected those sensors or some internal quality control that automatically triggers to avoid that mishap because of all of the tremendous implications and the outcome it caused. I'm putting the company or companies, depending on the structure, the vertical, where did it start, where the data come from, who put it out, they're all exposed to lawsuits.
Even Google, because in this case, Google was a data supplier.
If somebody, meaning an attorney or a large firm, can establish that it was something that you should not have screwed up, you should not have messed up, it's something that was simple, you should have known, right? You didn't do enough to make sure that the data was a false negative, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, Google would have exposure too. Absolutely.
And it's one thing, in some of the cases that you mentioned earlier, back, 30, 40, 50 years or more, that we had the technology over there at that time that was not the technology of today, right?
Right.
So today there's so many different ways, essentially, they can validate the data. You can make sure they have continuous flow of data and so on, which actually make the regulations even more important, I feel, right? Because many times people, they see the regulation as a sort of, let's put it this way, they don't welcome a regulation very often, even if it is for your own health. And if we're talking now about air quality, but if we go back in time, there was a time that even doctors were advertising cigarettes as a healthy habit,
Right.
or there was a time that people didn't want to use seatbelts.
Correct.
Although now we know that they have saved millions and millions of people's lives, and they do that every day, as a matter of fact, right?
Right.
So the same thing I think applies with air quality. We are in a transitional phase because, um, and I can show you a picture of New York City, 1960s, when there was not really regulations. Actually, I don't think that EPA was even established in 1960s, and it looked worse than New Delhi, India.
Yeah.
But today, actually, because of regulation, it's considered one of the air quality there. It's considered to be one of the best from among all the metropolitan cities around the world, and we know that firsthand because we're doing the monitoring there, so we see the data every day. So, what is your take on that? On how regulation is adapted, or how easily is adapted by the people and communities?
Meaning, how is the regulation that is imposed ultimately?
Yes.
Well, again, it's like everything else. It's catch up. Meaning, you know, uh, the presumption is, when a regulation is imposed, it's promulgated by a governmental body. Obviously, they have people, experts testifying. They hear from the public. They may have their own task force. They presumably in good faith base it on data. They base it on information, right? So it's sort of like, well, if the government's doing it themselves, but they also do it from the private sector. They want to hear, quote unquote, the experts, the people who are leading with the data that's reliable and credible, to say, should we promulgate something? But once it's and if they say yes and they issue a standard, a safety standard of some sort, at first with the seatbelts and the smoking, when they're everybody's conditioned habitually, seatbelts, nothing happens to me. Nobody's used seatbelts. It's almost like a cultural thing not to do it. And then with the passing of time, that becomes almost,
And no break.
reckless. So I'm like,
Yes.
how can you not wear a seatbelt?
Yeah.
Where back then it was like, how can you wear a seatbelt? This is like a cumbersome, ridiculous thing when it's first issued as a requirement under the law. Now it's reflexive. You walk in, you sit in your car, whoop, whoop, right? Automatically. So it's, I don't know what the cart and the horse is. I mean, the private sector can lead to a regulation, but then the regulation also changes habits. So there's sort of a dynamic duo going on at the same time. Not same time, but there seems to be an evolutionary process where one gives rise to the other, and it's sort of like a dialectic. Sorry for the fancy word, but there's a constant tension, which is good, which is healthy, which creates the progress of safety while accommodating for what the populace and the population, both commercially, the commercial populace, if you call, and the residents and the people populace, as to what they react to and what they're going to respond to.
And speaking of progress and evolution, with all these AI tools now, this immense amount of data that is collected every day from platforms like ours, um, how do you think the law and regulation will evolve in the days and years to come as part of this?
I think there is no question with the climate issues, with all the data that has created globally, with the uh, the air quality due to the climate issues, the environmental issues with the fires, which are unprecedented. That this is we're not going back to the early 1900s and the World War II time in terms of climate and the amount of contamination and air quality issues. It's only going to get more and more significant where there's going to have to be a response, and the responses are already occurring. They're not formalized, right? I mean, we have the Clean Air Act, right? But it only goes so far because the Clean Air Act doesn't really address, and I don't want to get in the weeds with the Clean Air Act, but it address these granular issues. There's going to be more regulation, even if it's on a local or statewide basis, right? It's just going to happen. And what the regulatory bodies at whatever level of government it's going to be is they're going to need, and this is not just a plug for your product, Vasilius, because I'm somewhat familiar with it. At this point, talking about the glitch in Chicago, they're going to want reliable, credible, sort of unimpeachable data that any expert can look at and say, that data is accurate. This is the data it is true. It rings true. It is true. It tests challenges in a scientific method, and it's irrefutable. Okay, you want that essentially gold standard if there's going to be reliance on that by the government or whatever level, and you want the gold standard for, therefore, if the government's going to act on that data, that people can feel safe and feel confident in. And frankly, it's like the seatbelt again, right?
Yeah.
The government did that. They showed with statistics and studies, safe belts are safe, and it's good for the public. It's not just for your individual, but the economic harm from accidents and deaths, with seatbelts, how that could be mitigated significantly if you wear the seat. That was a public safety issue, right? That's why it was promulgated. It wasn't just because I want to be in your car and telling you what to do. It was a public safety issue. The air quality as we progress into, the end of the 2020s into the 2030s is become such a universal public safety issue. We're going to see more and more governmental entities wanting to respond to that. And that's why data is so critical, to make sure that you have the good data and the right data so they can respond accurately.
So I think we had a very good conversation.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
I enjoyed it as well, and I hope our audience also found this very interesting, so they can see the perspective of law into air quality and environmental data. So, Steve, thank you very much for your time today, and I hope to see you again in one of our next podcasts.
Yes, and thank you for having me.